This video contains discussions and mentions of World War II, the Holocaust, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, psychological and social experiments, specifically the Milgram Experiment, anti-Semitism, ableism, bullying, and fascism. Please proceed with caution. And before we start, please note that sometimes in the audio it sounds like I'm saying bystanders instead of bystanders for some reason, so just keep that in mind. The year is 1961, 16 years after the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively, and the District Court of Jerusalem is currently trying Adolf Eichmann, SS Lieutenant Colonel and one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, on 15 separate counts, including crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in a hostile organization. That same year, Dr. Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, conducts what we know today as the Milgram Experiment, in which he creates a situation that would answer these 2 questions. Could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? The experiment consists of 3 main characters. Firstly, the experimenter, who gives orders to 2, the teacher and subject of the experiment, who then goes on to give the 3rd character, the learner, a painful electric shock anytime they get the teacher's answer wrong. In reality, however, the learner is an actor and the electric shock is just a sound effect. In Milgram's first set of experiments, 65%, 26 out of 40 of the experiment's participants, administered the final massive 450-volt shock, and all administered shocks of at least 300 volts. The subjects experienced physical signs of discomfort in following orders, including seizures. But the results for Milgram were clear. In 1974, Milgram summarized the experiment in his article entitled The Perils of Obedience, writing, "Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority." To Milgram, the results adequately answered the aforementioned question. Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders. But to others, the applicability to the Holocaust fell more than short. James Waller, the chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College, argued 4 main reasons for this. Firstly, the subjects or teachers in Milgram's experiments were told in advance that no permanent physical damage would result from the electric shocks, but that the perpetrators of the Holocaust were well aware of the permanency of the violence they inflicted on their victims. Secondly, the subjects didn't know their victims and were not motivated by the extreme anti-Semitism and other biases the Nazis had. Thirdly, Waller argues that the subjects experienced anguish and conflict while giving the shocks, and had no clear goal, unlike the Nazis who knew exactly what they were doing and were working for a common goal. Lastly, the experiment only lasted an hour. There was no time for the subjects to think about what they were doing. Meanwhile, the Holocaust lasted years, which gave time for those involved to reflect on the morality of their actions. Another refuter of Milgram's experiment, Thomas Blass, the author of the 2004 book The Man Who Shocked the World, said, "My own view is that Milgram's approach does not provide a fully adequate explanation of the Holocaust. While it may well account for the dutiful destructiveness of the dispassionate bureaucrat who may have shipped Jews to Auschwitz with the same degree of routinization as potatoes to Birmingham, it falls short when one tries to apply it to the more zealous, inventive, and hate-driven atrocities that also characterized the Holocaust." Milgram responded to criticism, saying that some just didn't want to confront the evil that was right in front of them, which can be read in his 1974 book Obedience to Authority, An Experimental View. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem ended on December 15, 1961, after which he was sentenced to hang. 2 years later, in 1963, Hannah Arendt wrote one of the most influential works on the trial entitled Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. In the book, she comments on Eichmann's unremarkableness, and calls him, well, a clown. Despite all the efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man was not a monster, but it was difficult indeed not to suspect that he was a clown. And since this suspicion would have been fatal to the entire enterprise, and it was also rather hard to sustain in view of the sufferings he and his like had caused to millions of people, his worst clowneries were hardly noticed and almost never reported. Arendt writes that Eichmann, and others like him, weren't bloodthirsty monsters with 3 heads and green eyes, but rather human. Evil doesn't take the shape of a grotesque unknown creature, but rather the form of an asinine human clown. And Arendt's observations in Jerusalem do at first seem to back up Milgram's 1961 experiment. Milgram actually publicly defended Arendt's work because he said her work supported his. To him, Eichmann, like Arendt wrote, wasn't a monster motivated by an ideology, he was just doing his job. But to me personally, when you actually look deeper into Arendt's thesis, I actually think they're at odds with Milgram's earlier findings. This is because it's easy to misinterpret Arendt's work, and many have, which we'll get to soon. And that's understandable if you don't look beyond Eichmann as some bureaucrat in the title of the book. Many people's takeaway is that anyone can be evil. Anyone has the potential to be Eichmann and do what he did. But that's actually not what Arendt is saying at all. What Arendt means by the banality of evil is that the way evil is enacted and by who is banal, not that everyone has a secret evil monster inside of them waiting to be unleashed. Banality in this sense does not mean that Eichmann's actions were in any way ordinary, or even that there is a potential Eichmann in all of us, but that his actions were motivated by a sort of complacency which was wholly unexceptional. Evil is enacted in very boring ways. Laws, rules, and orders. There's nothing grand or mysterious about it. And evil is enforced by equally unexceptionable people. There's nothing mystifying or puzzling about the people who committed these atrocities and war crimes, and thus they don't deserve to be studied or revered or respected. They're not worth our time, and that in the end is what Arendt wants to come across. She didn't want people to further glorify or infamize these criminals or think, that could be me. She wanted to make it known that they were wholly unexceptional and not the least bit special. I think nothing exemplifies how unremarkable evil is enforced more than a 1993 Holocaust memorial installation by Renate Stee and Friedrich Schnock, in which they posted more than 80 signs in Berlin which depict real anti-Jewish laws that the Nazis passed and that the Jewish people had to follow during the occupation. Evil isn't enforced by a gun to your head, by people yelling orders, or even looking over your shoulder. Rather, evil can be enacted by something as simple as a few words. That's not to say that laws and orders and rules aren't important or life-changing, because they obviously are, but rather that it's not how we expect evil to appear. It's not a masked villain, it's not a demon, it's just a rule, and that if enough people follow it, and if people assume that all laws are moral, nothing will be done to stop it. So what does this have to do with The Wave, the 1981 after-school special? Well, as you might already know, The Wave, both the novel and the film adaptation, are based on another 1960s social experiment. Note, I use that term very generously. This one taking place in Palo Alto, California at Cubberley High School in 1967, in which the teacher who conducted the experiment, Mr. Ron Jones, created a fake fascist movement called the Third Wave in order to answer the questions, how could the German people accept the actions of the Nazis, and later even go on to deny the Holocaust? Part 1. The Real Experiment. So it's 1967, 22 years after the end of World War II, and just 6 years after the Eichmann in Jerusalem trial, as well as the Milgram Experiment. Ron Jones, a contemporary world history teacher fresh out of college at just 25 years old, gets a question he can't answer. Just how could some of the German people deny the Holocaust? Note that this question is mainly targeted at Germans who weren't active in the Nazi Party, and according to the Wave After School special, less than 10% of the German people belonged to the Nazi Party. As far as Holocaust denial or knowledge during and after the war, scholars seem split on how much the regular everyday German public knew about the concentration camps, ghettos, and overall violence towards the Jewish people and other persecuted groups. However, they did know enough that what was happening to these groups wasn't good. Anyway, rather than just rationally explaining to his second, third, and sixth period sophomore contemporary world classes that the German people were ashamed of taking part in what they did or didn't do as bystanders while they watched their neighbors and countrymen disappear, and how that admitting anything would be extremely painful for them, he decided to teach them a lesson that would haunt them for years and which would eventually result in his own kidnapping. So let's set the scene. Firstly, I think it's important to bring up that Ron Jones, as a new young teacher, was seen as cool to his students and definitely unorthodox to more seasoned educators. For example, his sophomore contemporary worlds class was used to Jones's unorthodox way of bringing topics to life. He had taught them about apartheid by issuing cards with different rules for black and white students. He had invited guest speakers to talk about issues from all points of view. He even called Chairman Mao during one lesson. The article doesn't say if Chairman Mao answered, by the way. And this is just an aside, but the part about the rules for black and white students is just a huge red flag for me as a student. Like, we already have segregation in the US where black and white students are treated differently. We don't need to bring history to life, and also, who is this even for? I always hated when teachers did like these little bring history to life lessons, even as a kid. I remember one day in elementary school when we were learning about World War II and the Holocaust, the teacher separated the class by eye color, and some students got special treatment. It was just weird and also unnecessary. There's already a hierarchy in school and in life based on appearances, and kids of different backgrounds already know that. Anyway, this is all to say that the students trusted Mr. Ron Jones. They liked him and thought he was cool and fun, which is probably why the wave worked so well on them, other than him already being a well-established authority figure as their teacher and them being sophomores and 15 years old. So what was the experiment? And again, I use that term loosely. Well, Ron Jones created a fake movement called the Third Wave that would, unbeknownst to them, have some facets of fascism, so the students could take part and realize how easy it is to be swept up in us versus them ideology. For example, he made all the students in his class address him as Mr. Jones before speaking to him. He gave them a salute, a logo, told them how to sit up straight, put their feet on the floor, and stare with their eyes facing front. Lastly, he gave them a slogan: strength through discipline, strength through community, and strength through action. He gave them a supreme sense of purpose and no small amount of cliquishness. Mr. Ron Jones was also able to break up the class. As one former student recounts, he broke up lines of communication between students. Some had been friends for 10 years, but you couldn't trust anybody. If you had any doubts or questions or thoughts of resistance, you couldn't tell anyone because you would get in trouble. You didn't dare ask whether it was real or not. Another former student recalls, if you broke the rules, you would get in trouble with his secret police, who were unknown to us. He had snitches that would turn friends involuntarily. There was this real fear and intimidation. It was like a police state. The experiment lasted around 5 days, and it grew and grew until other students, not under Mr. Ron Jones's instruction, became part of the movement. It was becoming too big to handle, and soon parents were complaining. According to the Cubberley High School newspaper, The Catamount, published April 21, 1967, just after the experiment, one group reportedly had 500 parents backing a boycott to remove Jones as a teacher because of a movement they didn't quite understand. Later, his 5th period senior government class launched the most successful coup d'etat on Wednesday, April 5th, the last day of the movement, as they kidnapped Jones and threatened to deliver lectures on democracy to his sophomore classes. However, he persuaded them to let it go, telling them he had planned to end the movement that day with a rally at lunch. At the rally later that day, a large group of supporters assembled and Jones announced that they would hear from their leader, but then admitted that the whole thing was an elaborate hoax in an attempt to answer that sophomore student's question. Reactions were mixed. As one second period third waver put it, everyone feels stupid about it. He sure made fools of us. I guess I expected a national leader. Another student, Mr. Jones's personal bodyguard, expressed the opinion that, I really kind of liked it. I went to the rally because I was curious. One student said, it was probably the most interesting unit I've had. It was successful in its goal to achieve the emotions of the Germans under Nazi reign. As Ron Jones would say decades later about the experiment, we're all capable of this nightmare. And you can probably guess, if you watch the entire intro of this video, what I think about that. Part 2. He didn't answer the question. Something that really bothers me about the third wave experiment, if you can even call it that, is that it doesn't answer the question posed by the sophomore student, and Ron Jones never steps up and says, I'm your leader. I'm the one you've been following for the past week. The question the student posed was how could non-Nazi party members, just regular everyday citizens, deny the Holocaust and stand by and do nothing as millions died? Not how did the Nazis feel after the Holocaust, which honestly most didn't feel too bad about. The wave members were the Nazis in this long extended metaphor. They weren't bystanders, they were part of the regime. Maybe they stood by and let their friends get snitched on or ignored when their classmate was sent to the library for unruly behavior, but they were still part of the movement. It would have been more interesting if the focus were on outsiders of the wave, who saw a kid being beat up by wave members and did nothing, or people who weren't actively under Mr. Ron Jones's watchful eye, or people who joined on their own accord, or people who thought that the wave was violent but still tolerated them, or just people who were ambivalent as long as it wasn't affecting them. The wave was affecting all of Ron Jones's students, whether they stood by or were actively making membership cards and banners, and therefore they were the Third Reich in the experiment. They were the 10%. The experiment doesn't answer how the other 90% of the German people felt after World War II because it doesn't focus on the other 90% of students who saw the wave and kept going on with their lives. I guess in a way it could answer the question by just making them feel extremely guilty. They were part of the wave where friends were turning on friends and where they created these in and out groups, and that guilt is sort of reminiscent of how some German people felt, and maybe the kids felt ashamed for being in the wave afterward or not standing up enough against the wave when they could, and that mimics how the German people didn't want to talk about what they did or didn't do during the war, but I don't really know. If the Milgram experiment can conclusively be applicable to the Holocaust, I doubt the third wave experiment ever could. I also think that you don't need to create a fake fascist movement to teach kids about bystander guilt or make them feel ashamed for joining a hoax to mimic how real people might have felt going through or going along or tolerating a truly repulsive and evil movement. How could some Germans deny their part in the Holocaust? How could they not? It's shameful. It brings up uncomfortable feelings of guilt and sadness, anxiety and depression. It's not something one is quick to own up to. Haven't you ever seen a kid get bullied and not do anything because it's easier to be the one laughing in the crowd than the individual who stands up? That's all Mr. Jones needed to say in order to get his point across. But no, instead he felt the need to really hammer in this lesson by wetting his beak in a little bit of narcissism and self-indulgence. Lastly, of course Ron's students accepted the wave. He's their teacher. He even threatened to lower their grades if they didn't obey. So it's not really an experiment that's proving anything, it's more like a really long role-play game. I don't know, I really just can't stand teachers like that. So where is Ron Jones now? 2 years after the experiment, Cubberley School refused Jones's tenure to huge student protests because, he says, of his anti-war activities. He has spent the past 30 years working with people with mental disabilities. In the end, he did admit to liking the experiment a little too much, and liking that power. He also said that he would never do the wave again, and you can't put students, specifically 15-year-old children, in danger. He says, you can't take children and place them in danger. You unleash something in your own soul, which is even more devastating. The reality that you like it, and that order and control are pretty exciting. We all went through something together. I was not outside the experience. Part 3. The Afterschool Special. 14 years after the third wave took place at Cubberley High School, an after-school educational special was made and broadcast in the U.S. Subsequently, author Todd Strasser's novel, The Wave, written under the pen name Morton Rue, is actually a novelization of the TV special by Johnny Dawkins, which I'm sure some of you remember reading in class, or maybe some of you watched the dramatization like me. Anyway, the opening shows the class learning about the Holocaust, and Ron Jones then says less than 10% of the German people belong to the Nazi Party in response to the question, were all Germans Nazis? Then one student asks the now infamous question, how come nobody tried to stop them? The class bell rings, and Ron Jones stays up all night reading history books on Nazi Germany, trying to come up with an answer to the annoyance of his wife and fellow teacher, Donna. The next day, Ron Jones starts the wave experiment. He tells the students about strength through discipline and uses 2 popular football players as examples of how great discipline is and how it can be used to change the outcome of your life. He teaches them to sit with their feet flat on the ground, address him as Mr. Jones, and to stand when addressing him, and plays a little game with them to see how fast they can get to their seats, all in the name of efficiency. And this efficiency will, as Jones says, lead to better learning, better test results, and overall a better education. Robert, who's characterized in the movie as a lone wolf who reads comic books and is a bit overweight, and who's been bullied for no reason up until now, really gets into it and is even praised by Mr. Jones instead of being put down by or made fun of by him like he usually is.
Robert, please excuse us if we're boring you.
But it's not just Robert who gets into it. All of the kids get into it, as if they just needed someone to whip them into shape, because that's what kids love. And I do think that structure in a kid's life is good, and it's good that these small techniques help with the kids' learning, and even help Robert from being bullied, as Mr. Jones attempts to eliminate cliques and hierarchies within the class. But I also hate how adults have this idea that loner kids or nonconformist quote-unquote loser kids who read manga and dress or look differently from the other kids are just dying for someone to tell them how to act or how to be, or dying to fit in. Usually, nonconformist kids are nonconformists because they don't want to fit in. They like being who they are and want to be accepted as such, but examples like these push the idea that all kids want is an adult to tell them what to do, when in reality that's not true. Yes, kids want to fit in, but they want to fit in on their own terms, not because they're finally conforming to this idea of what is socially acceptable. None of the bullies, the football players for example, ever get taught a lesson that, hey, maybe under this new, more equal regime, things are better off for Robert and for the kids who are slow, as Lori puts it.
Even the slow kids are keeping up.
All right, that's all very well and good for the slow kids.
None of them learn to see Robert as a person after the big reveal that the wave is all a hoax. None of them reflect on their previous actions on how they bullied Robert just to feel superior. The only person who feels some remorse is Mr. Jones, who by the way is played excellently by Bruce Davidson, like he's really convincing. Mr. Jones needs to stop the wave, as it's no longer possible to control, but he almost doesn't when he sees how happy Robert is, how Robert is finally not being bullied anymore. But after the jock and preppy girl Lori convinces Jones enough is enough, he pulls the plug, but at least consoles Robert a little before the film fades to black. If anything, the main point about Robert for kids watching the after-school special is, don't bully the loner kid because he could turn into a fascist. Oh, and the loner kids are really weak-minded and will fall for anything, even though they're the ones who usually go against the grain. Because that makes sense. What I also really don't like about the Wave short film is that there is so much good that comes out of the Wave, but it's just too much, so they have to kill it entirely. There's no nuance. It's either competitive individualism or nothing. For example, Lori is one of the first students to go against the Wave and see how out of hand it's getting, how Wave kids are beating up non-Wave kids, how there's now a secret police, and how people have been all consumed by this holier-than-thou attitude. However, she's also one of its first supporters. She loves how it's helping more kids learn by getting rid of distractions like cliques, and she likes being part of a group who shares her same ideals about learning. But once she starts acting out against the Wave in the second act, her boyfriend, David, refutes that she only doesn't like the Wave now because she's not the smartest in the class anymore.
You know, you're just against this thing because you're not special anymore. Because you're not the best student in the class now.
I didn't put this in the video, but David is like an awful boyfriend. At the climax of the movie, he pushes Lori to the ground, and that act of violence is his come to Jesus moment, where he realizes how terrible the Wave is, and then the two of them go talk to Mr. Ross or Mr. Jones or whatever, and by the end of the film, they're still together as a couple. She's not at the top, and she's just jealous that kids like him, David, who weren't that good at school before, are now just as good.
David? Studying? Now there's something to worry about.
He brings up an interesting point about how there's this tension of individuality versus community, and how in this collective, individuality isn't rewarded, and how Lori might just want to end the Wave because she had to give up her spot at the top. And this goes even beyond fascism versus democracy, but heads into communism versus capitalist ideology, which makes sense considering the 1980s were part of the Cold War. One of the biggest pillars of the Wave is community, and how special the community is, and when everyone is learning, we all learn. Individualism is given up for the greater good of the group, so all of the students can learn, so Robert doesn't get bullied, so everyone can keep up. But because this is a US broadcasted special, this is seen as wrong and bad and something non-negotiable. Lori needs her individualism back, even though it might mean that some kids are going to fall behind. There's no room for talking about rewarding individual effort, along with keeping the community intact. In fact, when the Founding Fathers are brought up as an example of a group for good, Lori's mom shuts that down by saying that they were still individuals, as if they couldn't be both individuals and also part of a group. It's just so frustrating to me that the good parts of the Wave are still seen as bad by the end because you were following Hitler all along, so everything is a lie. Not just that, but the special argues that the old system was actually better when kids like David were doing bad in school, and where Lori was monopolizing the class, and where Robert was being made fun of for, again, just existing. I do have to say, though, that I do like the special despite its odd ideological flaws. I like the pacing, I like the characters, I like how Mr. Ron Jones is truly conflicted with what he's doing, and sees the benefits and the negative sides of what he did. I like how he's not shown in a positive light and rather is seen as someone who should be questioned. I still cringe at the "that's your leader" thing though at the end because no, Mr. Jones, you're their leader. Conclusion. In the end, I'm glad The Wave, the TV show special, exists. I found myself really liking the dialogue and the arguments presented, and just overall really liked engaging with it even though it sometimes makes me angry. As for the experiment, I wish it didn't have to happen. I know some of the students are still in communication with their old teacher and found him and the lesson really impactful and learned to question authority, but if that was me, I would have hated him. I had a professor in college who I made a video about who treated his class like a military regime, as he was a veteran himself. We weren't allowed to chew gum, lean against the wall, put our hands in our pockets, and every morning we had to address him as sir. And if we didn't follow the rules, he would embarrass us in front of the other students. And I, as a loner kid, hated this kind of discipline, very much unlike Robert. But even so, I followed orders because I had to. Otherwise, he could be really mean. He would curse at you, go on his own ideological rants about how great Trump was, specifically after the travel ban was enacted, and when I went to report him, I couldn't go through with it because I was so scared he would hold me back from graduating, as this was my spring semester of my senior year. But in the end, he did find out someone from our class reported him, and like a true authoritarian, he went on a tirade, grabbed a kid's tennis racket, and started swinging it around screaming about how his classroom wasn't a hostile environment. I also had a teacher who just stood up on his desk and screamed, "I am God," in middle school, so maybe I'm just unlucky in the teacher department. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I really hoped you liked this one, and if you did, please give it a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.